One of our favorite speakers, Mitch Anthony, says retirement is an illusion because those who can afford the illusion are disillusioned by it, and those who cannot afford the illusion are haunted by it. This begs the question, what mindset do we need to have to prepare well for retirement?
Today we get to talk about that shift to retirement and the expectations that we have and some of the ways that we can approach that in a more redemptive or positive way. So it'll be fun. We'll get to go through 7 tips of how we can approach this maybe more helpfully. And we do want to reference Jeff Haanen and his book, An Uncommon Guide to Retirement. He goes into a lot more depth on this and a lot of other things. So again, let's dive into some of these pieces.
Yeah, so one of the big ones that we often see, we see commercials for this all the time, is the extended vacation. Mm-hmm. Why is this maybe a fallacy for what retirement really is?
Well, when we look at an extended vacation, we have those memories of being able to disconnect and reflect. And what surveys and what research would suggest is that there's merit to this and that you need to be able to get away for at least a week to even start to feel that level of rest. Yeah. So we do think, okay, in retirement, I'm going to be able to do that. But what the research also suggests is that there's a point of diminishing returns. Mm-hmm. So we get a couple of weeks beyond that and we start to say, well, what is this actually about? We get a level of rest, but then we don't have that purpose maybe that we need thereafter. We don't have a clarity of what are we doing. So those leisure activities are wonderful for those first few weeks. Again, but when we look at, say, 6 months down the road, if we have not kind of pivoted and gone in a different direction, been able to refocus, then that's where we start to make decisions maybe that are not that long-term approach.
Right. Well, and I think coming back to that quote from Mitch, it's like what we are sold oftentimes rarely meets our expectations, whether that's a new car or a new home or any of these other things. So it's not very surprising to think, oh, I'm sold this idea of I get to vacation all the time in retirement and that's going to be great. I'll travel the world. But oftentimes it just doesn't line up to where we want it. So can you give us some examples of maybe folks that we've interacted with where that's been the case, or they've retired and then 6 months later they're thinking, what do I do now?
Well, it's one of these elements of American culture where we realize that particularly for leaders, particularly for those who are in some level of management, have some level of intensity, especially with their jobs, they get tired. And when they're in their 50s or 60s or 70s, at some point, they just say, I need a break. But what they don't often recognize is that they need some elements of that work. They just don't need all the elements of that work. Yeah. The number of people that we work with out in Oak Ridge, for instance, who will take a couple of months or even a couple of weeks and then get right back into the workforce is staggering. Most people, when they retire, they may fail at retirement because they like some aspects and maybe they haven't reflected on those aspects that they like of the work enough, but there's such an intensity to that work. And so what we need to do is go in with eyes wide open of why are we retiring? What are those things that from work brought satisfaction and enjoyment that maybe we need to find a way to replicate some in retirement?
Right. And I think that you hit on a really key point there. There is satisfaction a lot of times in work, but if you've been working in a very high stress, high taxing job, then it does wear you down. We were made for work. Work is a good thing, but we can't work at the same pace in our 60s and 70s that we did maybe in our 20s and 30s.
Well, I can't work in my mid 40s at the same pace that I could in my late 20s. Yeah. I mean, all of us have to just grapple with our mortality as we move. We've talked about how we can't do red-eye flights in the same way that we could do 20 years ago. There's all kinds of different things that as we go into different seasons, we just have to set those expectations, but also recognize that there's a loss, on the other side of things. So, I like the quote from Brad Pitt, once you get everything, then you're just left with yourself. Most of us find ourselves pretty boring, and so there's only so many days that you want to go on vacation or go on the golf course or, the hobbies that you have if they're not adding value to other people's lives, if they're not contributing to the common good in some way and kind of thinking about things more broadly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with some of these tips that we can look into. We've talked about maybe the never-ending vacation is not the ideal place that you want to go in retirement. So as we start thinking about, okay, this is a new season. We've had our educational season, we've had our working season. Retirement is a new season of life. How do we start approaching that?
Well, one of the most helpful ways, I think, is to recognize first that it's a season and to plan to do something fun or to do a couple of things that are fun right at the start of that. So we can capture that this is a season where there's going to be some opportunity for fun, some opportunity for rest. To plan those up front so that we're also not unmoored where, we say, okay, a week into retirement, I'm receiving calls to come back and take this post and I'm tempted by it. Yeah. We want to be able to actually disengage, unplug for some period of time. And one of the ways that we can do that is we can say, okay, there's some really fun things that maybe I've been putting off or that I've always wanted to do. Let's do those the first few weeks of retirement. So that's the first pro tip. I think a second pro tip is, and we'll get into this the next podcast, is to structure the first part of retirement as a sabbatical, to be intentional with this. First 3 to 6 months, looking at that as a sabbatical. We'll look into some really good practices in our next podcast of how you can do that. But if we approach that and we say, we're going to have a finite period of time where we're really going to try to unplug from some of those rhythms that maybe wore us down and to prioritize, again, rest, be it both physical, spiritual, reconnecting with relationships, some of these different things, then we've got a period of time that we protect. And then if we feel called back into work, be that on an interim basis or consulting, or even right back to where we were, then we've at least had that buffer of a season to have a greater clarity that as we re-engage, we know what we're looking for, right? Which can be really, really helpful.
Right. And I think that idea of what am I moving towards in retirement? Right. What are you retiring to? Not just what are you retiring from? I think it's a really important question to be asking. What am I going to do next? And that season of sabbatical, that season of rest can be really helpful in identifying some of those things of what do I want to do in this next season? You also mentioned relationships. How does that change in retirement?
Well, the second thing that I think we really have to grapple with, first, again, that an unending vacation is going to be unsatisfying in retirement. Second thing really is, even if you weren't terribly close to some of the people that you worked with, you're likely going to miss a lot of those relationships. And studies and surveys would suggest that people miss those relationships far more than they recognize that they will when they're planning for retirement. So it's not something, again, that should keep us just in the workforce or keep us engaged in the same ways, but having an idea that this will have an impact and then that we can make some counter moves to be able to help bolster our relationships in that first season of retirement can be particularly effective.
Yep. And, I think the reality too is, if you go from a job where you're constantly around people to just being either alone or with your spouse, that can be jarring. Right. And there's often studies that say, especially for men, there's an increased rate of heart attack in the first couple months of retirement. So really, we're made for work. We're also made for community. And so if you take both of those foundational pieces out of someone's life, it can be incredibly jarring.
Well, and this happens in our culture, but also cultures around the world. You look at a BBC study and report that suggested that there's a 40% higher rate of depression in that first month or two of retirement because there's change, there's the relationships that we really, even if we weren't terribly close, people depend upon us. And there's that level of connection that we have, even in just being able to do something together.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of these tips. What's that third one here?
So I think the third one is just identifying the people that we would like to connect with in that first season of retirement. We need to think about this in a couple different ways. One is, who are the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis that I really want to maintain those relationships? Because if you're not seeing them day-to-day, you're not going to maintain that same level of relationship. So you need to identify those folks first. Second is those folks that maybe you've always wanted to be able to build a relationship with or a friendship with, or that you have some level of common ground with that you would like to, spend a little bit of more time, whether it's having a cup of coffee or going out and grabbing lunch or whatever it might be. Now you're going to have a little bit more space. So being able to recognize and then plan for that can be really helpful. Because if you get to retirement and you say, wow, I'm just feeling overwhelmed, I don't have these relationships. If you've not thought through these steps that you might take, then you may feel just stuck.
Yeah. Well, that leads right into the fourth one of creating an actual plan of who do you want to meet with? Where do you want to spend your time? Can you walk us through that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think you have to recognize that everybody's got different schedules. So we identify the people in that pro tip number 3, the people that we want to connect with, but then we also start to look at our own schedule, our own rhythm, and how we can then be able to fit those relationships in a way that's really helpful. So, if we reach out to folks and say, hey, can you have coffee tomorrow? Well, if they're still working, that may be tough. But if we say, hey, in a couple weeks, I'd love to be able to connect with you. Here's some times that work for me. Oftentimes, that will actually allow that other person to first feel like they're valued, and second, be able to organize their schedule where they can connect with you. So there's a lot of good things that can happen when we think about actually scheduling time for those relationships that are going to be most important to us.
Yep. Okay, so we've got, first off, the never-ending vacation is a fallacy. The second piece is relationships are really important. So the third major piece is, even if your job was taxing and draining, the reality is you put your hands to something. You added value to some organization, whether it was hard and laborious or you really enjoyed it. The fact is you put your hands to work, and that can be really good. So talk us through just kind of this next broad category of why we think having something to do in retirement is important.
Well, even for folks that don't particularly like some of their work, like you said, they're needed. And being needed by people, there's that level of relational connection. I mean, I just even think of folks that may be providing support in an office environment. And we've worked with people in the past that say nobody else knows how to even address problems with the copier, or no one else knows what needs to happen with the HVAC unit if something happens. There's things that people rely on us for that maybe psychologically, we don't even really recognize that we get some level of our identity there because we can just help. Yeah. We know what to do. People depend upon us. And so that can, again, form a piece of our identity. And we recognize that meaningful work is a great gift. Being able to pass on the value, being able to pass on the insight. So often when we get to the end of our careers, in at least a full-time capacity, we've got all of this accumulated wisdom that we can pass on in some different ways. And there's even a yearning or a desire to be able to do that, particularly if there's people that we appreciate, in our work. Even if we don't like our employer that much, there's still people that we appreciate there. So I think recognizing all of those things can help us say, okay, I'm going to need to replace this part of my identity with something else here in retirement. I'm going to need to be able to add value, to be able to bless other people in some way with my work, with my skill, with my energy, my acumen.
Yeah, so that's that fifth pro tip there. It's identify a few areas where you can add value. This can be to another organization. I think that's a lot of time what we see when we have leaders in these large organizations, that a lot of people or responsibilities go on their shoulders. The step towards retirement is stepping away from that, but they still have value to add. They've got wisdom. And so identifying either arenas that you can continue to consult in, continue to add value to a labor force, or people that you can actually mentor and pour into. What about that sixth pro tip? Identify your first step and get involved in these spaces and take action early. Talk about that.
Well, so often we don't take the time to plan our next steps. We don't really even think, what's the smallest thing that I can do to get me going in this direction? And sometimes for folks that are going through massive change, changing relationships, changing their rhythm of life, changing their what the value is they're delivering, they can just get stuck so easily. So identifying the smallest next step, and it might even be that you don't know the person that you need to contact at a particular charitable institution. Well, the next step might just be calling their main line and asking for information. That might be the next step. When we break it down to something that simple, say, okay, sometime today, that's all I need to do. We can get unstuck when we have, again, just that next step. And of course, there's a lot more next steps thereafter, but the first step, oftentimes in that direction, we start to be able to visualize that value that we'll be able to deliver to that group. And that can create that momentum that we really need to change in retirement, to change in that next season.
Yeah. Okay, so this last one, reassess after 6 months of involvement, what you might want to tweak. So talk us through that.
Well, so often too, people get stuck because they say, well, I don't know if I'm going to really like this. The thing that we come back to is you're not married to this nonprofit or to this role that you might explore. Give yourself space to be able to go into this next season and know that you're going to have to figure it out a little bit. That you are not married to this role that you might even have. I mean, you might be serving some institution. Let's say you were serving Second Harvest here in Knoxville, and you thought that you might enjoy helping them load their trucks. But then after the first time you did it, you just said, this isn't for me. Well, it doesn't mean that you couldn't tweak or say, well, I want to do something else, or I want to do something different. But giving ourselves the space to reassess, and whether that's 6 months or 3 months or some other period of time. We say 6 months because that gives a period of both rest, but also a chance to engage something, so that you can then reflect and say, okay, well, what are my next steps there?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap this episode up, we want to say, when you think about what you're called to in retirement, what are those next things? It can be broad. It can be people, causes, activities. There's a lot of things that you can do with this next season, but it's really important to be intentional about that next season. And so, clients, if you have any questions about next steps that you can take in planning for your retirement, not just financially, but in thinking through what do you want to retire to, we'd love to have a conversation with you. With that, take care and we'll see you next time. If you like these financial planning videos, please share it with a friend. And if you have questions, go to our website at SeriousRetirement.com. This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We are located in Knoxville, Tennessee. You can visit our website at SeriousRetirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only, and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents. Advisory services offered through Retirement Planning Services, LLC.